After witnessing his father's violent death during a terrifying night in the forest, young Ethan is consumed by guilt and torn from the only home he's ever known. Thrust into the chaos of the city, he feels lost and haunted by the memory of that fateful night. The forest stretched endlessly, dark and silent under the moonlit sky. It was a cold night, and 10-year-old Ethan sat in the passenger seat of the truck, clutching his jacket tight. His father, Paul, a park ranger, was beside him, hands gripping the steering wheel as they navigated the rough terrain. Ethan had always admired the way his father moved through the woods, calm, confident, as if the trees whispered secrets only he could hear. Tonight, though, something felt different. Paul glanced over at his son and smiled, trying to ease the tension he sensed from the boy. "Not much longer now, bud. Just one last check around the perimeter and we'll head home." Ethan nodded but stayed silent. He liked going on patrols with his dad, but tonight, the shadows between the trees seemed thicker, more menacing. The headlights of the truck barely cut through the dense darkness, and the usually familiar sounds of the forest were replaced by an eerie stillness. As they drove deeper into the woods, Paul's radio crackled to life. Ethan watched his father's face tighten as he listened to the faint voice coming through. It was the ranger station, warning of sightings of a wild animal, possibly a large predator, roaming near their current location. "Stay in the truck, okay?" Paul said firmly as he parked near the old ranger station, his eyes scanning the trees. "I'll be right back." Ethan's heart raced as his father stepped out into the cold, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Alone in the truck, Ethan stared out into the thick darkness, trying to keep his breathing steady. He told himself that everything would be fine. His father was an expert. Nothing ever went wrong when Paul was around. But then, a sound broke through the silence, a low growl, deep and menacing, echoing through the trees. Ethan's eyes widened, and before he could stop himself, he unbuckled his seatbelt and slid out of the truck, ignoring his father's command. "Dad?" Ethan called, his voice trembling slightly. He could barely see beyond the dim beam of his flashlight. "Dad!" Suddenly, there was a crash in the underbrush. Paul came running into view, his face pale with fear, but it wasn't Ethan he was looking at. It was something behind him. Ethan turned just in time to see a large shape moving in the shadows, eyes gleaming in the darkness. The creature lunged. "Ethan, run!" Paul's voice cut through the air, sharp and filled with urgency. But Ethan was frozen. He couldn't move, his legs locked in place as the enormous figure of the animal, a wolf larger than any he had ever seen, barreled toward him. Paul was faster, though. He shoved Ethan aside and threw himself in front of the beast, wrestling it away from his son. Ethan fell to the ground, watching in horror as his father fought with everything he had. Blood sprayed through the air as the creature's jaws found purchase, and Paul let out a pained cry. Time seemed to slow as Ethan watched, helpless, tears streaming down his face. Paul's eyes found Ethan's, and in that final moment, there was no fear, only love. "Run, Ethan, please." It was the last thing Ethan heard before his legs finally responded, and he took off into the woods, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran blindly, stumbling over roots and rocks, his father's voice echoing in his ears. Behind him, the sounds of the struggle faded, replaced by a chilling silence that he knew would haunt him forever. Ethan didn't know how long he had run or how he found his way back to the ranger station, but when he finally did, he collapsed onto the steps, gasping for breath. The cold night air cut through him, but nothing felt colder than the emptiness in his heart. His father was gone. That night marked the end of Ethan's childhood innocence. He had survived, but a part of him had been lost in the woods alongside his father. The guilt settled deep inside him, and no matter how much time passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he could have done something more. That maybe, somehow, he could have saved his father. For now, though, all he could do was stare into the darkened forest, where the trees stood silent, keeping their secrets. Weeks had passed since the night in the woods. The day after the attack, search teams found Ethan trembling at the ranger station, his clothes torn and his face streaked with tears. His father, Paul, had not been as lucky. The news spread quickly through the small rural town, and soon after, arrangements were made. With no other close family nearby, Ethan was sent to live with his distant cousins, Megan and Todd, in the city, miles away from the forest that had once been his home. The drive to the city was long, and Ethan stared blankly out of the car window as the landscape transformed from green, rolling hills and dense woods to towering skyscrapers and endless rows of cars. He clutched a worn jacket of his father's, the last thing he had left of him. The smells, the sounds, even the way the air felt in the city was different, heavy, suffocating. He could hear the constant hum of engines, honking horns, and the murmur of voices everywhere. It all pressed down on him, unfamiliar and overwhelming. "We're almost there, Ethan," Megan said softly, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. She was trying to be kind, but Ethan didn't respond. He hadn't spoken much since the night in the woods, his grief trapping him in a silent world. He barely knew Megan and Todd, only having met them a few times at distant family gatherings. Now, they were supposed to be his new guardians, but to Ethan, they were just strangers. When they finally pulled up in front of the apartment building, Ethan felt even more out of place. The building loomed over him, its concrete walls cold and lifeless, a far cry from the small cabin he had lived in with his father. Inside, the apartment was neat, cozy even, but it was too clean, too ordered. There were no signs of the wilderness, no dirt underfoot, no scent of pine and earth in the air, no quiet moments of solitude like he had known in the forest. "Ethan, why don't you come in and take a look around?" Megan urged gently as she held the door open for him. Todd stood behind her, offering a polite but awkward smile. Ethan stepped inside, but the moment he did, the noise from the city outside grew louder in his head. The honking, the voices, the constant movement. It felt like the walls were closing in. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but all he could think of was the forest. The last place he had felt his father's presence. Megan showed him to his room, a small space with a window overlooking the busy street below. There were posters on the walls of sports teams and music bands Ethan didn't recognize, and the bedspread was brightly colored, as if trying too hard to be cheerful. It was all wrong. It didn't feel like home. "You can decorate however you want, change things around," Megan said, her voice soft. "We want you to feel comfortable here, Ethan." Ethan didn't answer. He just nodded mechanically and sat down on the edge of the bed, clutching his father's jacket tighter. Megan and Todd exchanged worried glances before leaving him alone, closing the door gently behind them. The first few days in the city blurred together. Ethan felt like a ghost moving through someone else's life. He didn't know how to fit in, didn't even want to try. Megan and Todd were kind. They tried to talk to him, involve him in family meals, take him out to explore the city. But each attempt only made Ethan feel more lost. The city was too loud, too busy. The constant noise felt like static in his mind, drowning out any sense of peace he might have found. He missed the quiet. He missed the forest. At school, things weren't any better. The other kids seemed worlds apart from him. They talked about video games, movies, and apps that Ethan had no interest in. No one understood the weight he carried. He found himself sitting alone at lunch, picking at his food and staring out the window at the playground, longing for the vast expanse of the woods where he and his father used to walk. One afternoon, as he wandered aimlessly down the crowded city streets, the memory of that night in the woods came rushing back. His father's voice, calling for him to run. The flash of the wolf's teeth. The sound of Paul's body hitting the ground. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to scream, but the noise of the city swallowed him whole. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape the guilt gnawing at his insides, the voice in his head that kept telling him, "You should have done something. You should have saved him." Megan noticed his growing silence, the way he barely reacted to anything around him. One evening, she sat beside him on the couch while Todd flipped through TV channels. "Ethan," she began hesitantly, "I know things have been hard. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I want you to know we're here for you. You don't have to go through this alone." But Ethan was alone. His father was gone, and nothing Megan or Todd said could change that. The city felt like a cage, and every day he spent away from the forest made the ache inside him grow stronger. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the never-ending sounds of the city outside his window, Ethan made up his mind. He couldn't stay here. Not in this place that suffocated him. Not with the weight of his father's death pressing down on his chest. He needed to go back. Back to the forest. Back to where his father had died. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's longing to return to the woods only intensified. He refused to let go of the memories he had of his father, no matter how painful they were. The city had taken everything from him. His peace, his connection to nature, the only home he had ever known. Megan and Todd did their best to reach out to him, but Ethan remained distant, his heart still in the forest. And so, with every passing day, the pull of the wilderness grew stronger, calling him back to the place where it had all begun. He just needed a way to get there. Ethan stood in the doorway of the small cottage Megan and Todd had rented for the weekend. It was in the countryside, far from the suffocating noise of the city. For the first time in months, Ethan could breathe. The air was crisp, and he could hear the distant rustle of trees in the wind. It wasn't the same as the forest where he had grown up, but it was close enough. He had convinced Megan and Todd to let him come here under the pretense of needing a break from the city. He knew they hoped the change of scenery would help him heal, but Ethan had a different plan. He wasn't just here to relax. He was here to return to the one place that still tied him to his father, the forest where Paul had died. Ethan waited until Megan and Todd were distracted, unloading the car and chatting about dinner. Then, he slipped away, heading down the dirt path that led into the trees. His heart pounded as the familiar scent of pine and earth filled his lungs, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. The deeper he walked into the woods, the more alive he felt. It was as though the forest had been waiting for him all this time, its quiet embrace offering him a solace he hadn't felt since that terrible night. The path was overgrown and unused, but Ethan remembered it well. He had traveled it many times with his father, back when their patrols were more of an adventure than a duty. Step by step, the memories flooded back. His father's deep laugh, the stories he would tell about the wildlife, the way he knew every inch of the land. Soon, Ethan reached the edge of the national park where Paul had worked. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the familiar sign, worn and weathered from years of rain and sun. Just beyond it was the oak tree, his father's tree. Paul had always loved that tree. It stood alone in a small clearing, its thick branches reaching toward the sky, strong and unshakable. They had often sat beneath it during their patrols, Paul resting against the trunk, telling Ethan stories about the park's history, about the animals that roamed its depths, and about the respect he had for nature. The sight of it brought tears to Ethan's eyes. He hadn't been here since the night his father died, but it felt like nothing had changed. The tree was just as he remembered, tall, strong, and timeless. It was the only thing that hadn't been touched by the tragedy that had turned his life upside down. Ethan approached the tree slowly, almost afraid to get too close. He dropped to his knees at the base of the trunk, his fingers tracing the rough bark as if trying to feel his father's presence in its ancient surface. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry." The guilt he had been carrying for months weighed heavier on him than ever. He had replayed that night in his head over and over again, searching for a way he could have stopped what had happened. Maybe if he hadn't frozen. Maybe if he had run sooner. Maybe if he had stayed in the truck like Paul told him to. Maybe then, his father would still be alive. Tears streamed down his face as he rested his head against the tree. "I should have done something," he sobbed. "I should have saved you." For a long time, Ethan sat there in silence, his body shaking with grief. The wind moved gently through the leaves above him, and for a moment, he imagined it was his father's voice, comforting him like he used to when Ethan scraped his knees or had nightmares. As he sat there, lost in his sorrow, a rustling sound came from behind him. Startled, Ethan wiped his eyes and turned around to see an older man approaching, his steps slow and deliberate. It was Harold, one of his father's old colleagues at the park. Harold had been a ranger with Paul for many years, and Ethan had met him several times during his childhood. He was a quiet man, gruff but kind, with a deep love for the forest much like Paul's. "Didn't expect to see you out here, son," Harold said, his voice low and steady. He looked at Ethan with kind, knowing eyes, as if he understood exactly what had drawn the boy back to this place. "I used to come here with your dad, you know. This was his favorite spot." Ethan wiped his face again, trying to regain his composure. He didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to be left alone, but another part of him, one that was tired of the silence he'd been living in, wanted to hear more. Harold sat down beside him, leaning his back against the oak tree. For a few moments, neither of them spoke, the only sound the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. "He was a good man," Harold finally said, breaking the silence. "Your dad loved these woods more than anything. He used to talk about them like they were a part of him, you know?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. Harold glanced at the boy, his expression softening. "I heard what happened that night. It wasn't your fault, Ethan." Ethan looked up, startled. "How can you say that? I could have done something. I should have." "There was nothing you could have done," Harold interrupted gently. "Your dad did what any father would do. He protected you. That's all he ever wanted, to keep you safe. But he died," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. "He died because of me," Harold sighed, leaning his head back against the tree. "He died because he loved you. Don't you ever forget that. Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, and he wouldn't want you blaming yourself for what happened." Ethan stared at the ground, his chest heavy with grief. He had heard similar words from others, Megan, Todd, even some of the counselors he had been forced to see. But hearing them from Harold, someone who had known his father as a man, not just as a figure, felt different. It felt real. "I miss him," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know you do, son. We all do." Harold placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, squeezing gently. "But you can't live in the past. Your dad wouldn't want that. He'd want you to keep going, to keep living." The two of them sat there in the quiet, the weight of unspoken grief hanging in the air. For the first time in months, Ethan didn't feel so alone. The guilt was still there, deep in his heart, but sitting beneath the oak tree, with Harold's steady presence beside him, Ethan felt a small spark of hope, a flicker of connection to his father that he had thought was lost forever. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Harold stood and extended a hand to Ethan. "Come on, kid. Let's get you back to your cousins. I think they're worried sick by now." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then took Harold's hand, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. As they walked back through the woods together, Ethan glanced over his shoulder one last time at his father's tree, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over him. He would return here again, he promised himself. One day, he would come back to this place and truly say goodbye. But for now, he took comfort in knowing that his father's memory would always be a part of these woods, and a part of him. As the days passed after his emotional return to his father's tree, Ethan's mind became consumed with thoughts of the forest. The brief moment of peace he had felt under that oak tree lingered, a small light in the darkness of his grief. But returning to the city with Megan and Todd had only reinforced the stark contrast between the life he longed for and the suffocating existence he endured in the urban jungle. Every morning, the noise of the city rattled Ethan awake, filling his head with the dissonance of honking horns, chattering strangers, and endless traffic. Megan and Todd, bless their hearts, tried their best to comfort him, but they didn't understand. They couldn't. The forest was the only place Ethan felt like he could breathe. One evening, just as the sun was setting over the tall buildings, there was a knock at the door. Megan answered it, and moments later, Ethan heard a familiar voice. A voice that brought back memories of the oak tree, of stories told by a fireside, and of his father. It was Harold. Ethan wandered into the living room, unsure of why Harold would visit the city. Harold stood in the entryway, his rough face softened by a gentle smile. Beside him was Lydia, Harold's wife, whom Ethan remembered faintly from his early childhood days spent in the park. She had always been kind, with a soothing voice that reminded him of a lullaby. "Evening, Ethan," Harold said with a nod, his eyes warm with familiarity. Megan looked surprised but smiled, gesturing for them to come in. "Harold, Lydia." "We weren't expecting visitors. Please, have a seat." Harold waved away the offer, his focus on Ethan. "We won't stay long," he said. "But Lydia and I wanted to talk to Ethan about something." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, and he wondered if Harold had come to tell him about his father again, about the man he could never forget. But Harold's next words took him by surprise. "We've been thinking, son," Harold began, scratching the back of his neck, "about how much Paul loved those woods, how much you love them too. And we were wondering if you might want to come stay with us for the summer." Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Stay with you?" he asked, his voice quiet. But there was a flicker of hope beneath the hesitation. Lydia stepped forward, her eyes filled with understanding. "We know how hard it's been for you, Ethan," she said softly. "Being away from the forest, from everything you and your father cherished. We live not far from the park, and we'd be happy to have you stay with us for a while. You could spend your days out in the woods, and we'd take care of you." Ethan's heart swelled with longing, but then came the creeping doubt. What would Megan and Todd think? They had done so much for him, taken him in when no one else had, even though they didn't understand his connection to the forest. Megan, sensing his hesitation, knelt beside him. "Ethan, it's okay," she said gently. "You've been through so much, and if being in the woods is what helps you feel better, then I think it's a good idea." Ethan looked up at her, his chest tightening. She smiled at him, though her eyes were a little sad. "You deserve some peace," she added. Todd, who had been standing quietly near the door, nodded in agreement. "You can come back anytime, Ethan. This is your home too." The offer hung in the air, and for the first time since his father's death, Ethan felt a glimmer of something he hadn't known was missing: freedom. A chance to return to the woods, to feel the earth beneath his feet and the wind through the trees. It was more than an offer. It was a lifeline. The drive to Harold and Lydia's cabin was quiet. Ethan stared out the window, watching as the towering buildings of the city slowly gave way to the rolling hills and wide-open fields of the countryside. The further they drove, the more the knots in his stomach began to loosen. Lydia spoke softly as they neared the cabin. "We're not too far from the park. You can go there anytime you want. Harold knows the area better than anyone, so he'll keep you safe." Ethan just nodded, his heart already racing with the thought of being back in the forest. The cabin, when they finally arrived, was small and rustic, nestled at the edge of a thick line of trees. It felt like the world had opened up around him again, the air cleaner, the sky wider, and the quiet more profound than anything he had felt in the city. Harold helped him with his bags, but Ethan barely noticed. His gaze was fixed on the woods beyond, a deep yearning pulling him toward the familiar shadows. "You'll have plenty of time to explore," Harold said with a knowing smile. "But let's get you settled first." Inside the cabin, Lydia had already prepared a simple meal, and the warm scent of stew filled the small living room. The space was cozy, with old wooden furniture and faded photographs on the walls, many of them of Harold and Paul from their ranger days. Ethan glanced at the pictures, seeing his father's face smiling back at him, and a lump formed in his throat. Over the next few weeks, the forest became Ethan's refuge. Each morning, he would rise with the sun and venture out into the woods, retracing the paths he and his father had once walked together. The rustle of the leaves, the calls of birds, the steady hum of the wilderness. It was all so familiar, so soothing. He felt closer to his father here, like Paul's spirit still lingered among the trees. Harold often joined him, sharing stories about Paul's time as a ranger, his adventures, and his deep love for the land. They walked the trails together, and for the first time in months, Ethan began to open up. He found himself talking about his father, about the guilt he still carried, about the dreams he had where Paul was still alive. "I wish I could have done something," Ethan confessed one afternoon as they sat by a creek, the water bubbling over the rocks. "I keep thinking if I hadn't frozen, if I had listened to him." Harold shook his head, his expression somber. "You were just a boy, Ethan. Your father made his choice to protect you because he loved you. No one could have changed that, not even you." "But I feel like I failed him," Ethan whispered. Harold sighed deeply, looking out over the water. "We all feel that way sometimes. But your dad, he wouldn't want you carrying that weight." He gave his life so you could live yours. The words echoed in Ethan's mind, but it was still hard to believe. Every night, as he lay in bed in the small room Harold and Lydia had given him, the memory of that night replayed in his head, the sound of the wolf's growl, the sight of his father's last moments. Even in the peace of the forest, the guilt still followed him, lingering like a shadow he couldn't escape. Lydia was kind and understanding, offering him quiet support when Harold was out patrolling. She would sit with him in the evenings, knitting by the fire, and tell him stories of her own. Stories about Paul from a time before Ethan had known him. Stories that made his father feel alive again, if only for a moment. Slowly, Ethan began to heal. The forest wrapped around him like a protective cocoon, its quiet strength giving him the courage to face his grief. But as the summer drew to a close, he knew that his time here was limited. The world outside the woods was waiting, and soon, he would have to choose. Return to the city with Megan and Todd, or find a way to stay connected to the place that had become his sanctuary. One late afternoon, as the sun cast long golden rays through the trees, Harold and Lydia sat Ethan down at the kitchen table. The air was heavy with the unspoken tension of a decision Ethan knew was coming. "We've talked to Megan and Todd," Lydia began, her voice gentle. "They're ready for you to come back to the city. They think it's time for you to start school again, to get back to a normal routine." Ethan felt his chest tighten. The thought of returning to the city made his skin crawl. The noise, the buildings, the constant rush. It was everything he had been running from. "But," Harold added, leaning forward, "if you want, we'd be happy to have you stay here longer. We could talk to your cousins, see if we can work something out." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had been dreading this moment, torn between two worlds, the quiet, healing presence of the forest and the life he was supposed to return to in the city. But now, there was a choice, and it was his to make. "I don't want to go back," Ethan said softly, looking down at his hands. "I don't belong there. Not anymore." Lydia smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "Then we'll figure something out, Ethan. You're not alone." For the first time in months, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. He didn't have to leave the forest. He didn't have to leave his father's memory behind. And maybe, just maybe, staying here would finally allow him to find peace. The decision was made. Ethan would stay with Harold and Lydia for as long as he needed. Megan and Todd, though sad to see him go, had understood that his heart was in the forest, where his father's memory lived on. The city had never been a place where Ethan could heal. The forest was his home, the only place that made sense anymore. For the first time since his father's death, Ethan felt a small sense of relief. He was staying in the place that brought him peace, and he was surrounded by people who understood him. People who had known and loved Paul, and who knew the woods as well as he did. Yet, as much as Ethan tried to embrace this new chapter, the guilt and grief still weighed on him, lurking in the back of his mind, refusing to let him go. One crisp, early autumn morning, Ethan set out into the forest alone. Harold had taught him how to navigate the woods with ease, and by now, he felt confident enough to wander off the well-worn paths and explore deeper into the wilderness. The trees were starting to change color, their leaves turning shades of gold and red, and the air was cool and fresh, filling Ethan's lungs with a sense of calm that he had only ever found in the forest. He walked for what felt like hours, his feet crunching softly on the fallen leaves. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the distant call of a bird. It felt peaceful, but there was also something else, a feeling deep in his gut, an unease that had been building for days. As much as Ethan loved the forest, it was also the place where he had lost his father. The trees that had once been his refuge were also haunted by the memory of that terrible night. Eventually, Ethan found himself standing in the same clearing where his father had died. The oak tree, towering and ancient, loomed over him, its branches stretching wide as if to shelter him from the weight of the past. Ethan knelt at the base of the tree, his fingers tracing the rough bark. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. He had come here so many times since that night, but this time felt different. This time, he wasn't running away from the memory. He was facing it head-on. He closed his eyes, feeling the cool breeze brush against his skin, and let the memories flood back, the growl of the wolf, his father's shout, the terror that had gripped him. He had run that night, just like his father had told him to. But in his heart, he had always wondered, what if I hadn't? I wish I could have saved you, Ethan whispered, tears welling in his eyes. I should have done more. But then, another voice broke through his thoughts, Harold's voice from weeks earlier, telling him that his father had made a choice to protect his son. Ethan looked up at the tree, the same tree where he had last seen his father alive. It had been his father's favorite spot, a place of peace and beauty, not a place of sorrow. Paul had loved this forest, and in his final moments, he had fought to protect what he loved most, his son. Maybe it was time to let go of the guilt. Ethan stood slowly, wiping his tears with the sleeve of his jacket. He knew now that his father's death wasn't his fault. He had done everything he could have done, and so had Paul. His father had given his life out of love, and nothing Ethan could have done would have changed that. As Ethan made his way back to the cabin, the air felt lighter, the weight on his chest lifting with each step. He was ready now, ready to let his father rest, to honor his memory by living the life Paul had wanted for him. A life filled with the beauty and peace of the forest, not the guilt that had followed him for so long. When he returned to the cabin, Harold was waiting for him on the porch, a quiet smile on his face as if he knew exactly what had just happened. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice gentle. Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I think I am." Harold clapped him on the shoulder, and together they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. The woods around them were quiet, the trees standing tall and proud like sentinels, guarding the memories of all who had walked their paths. As the sun disappeared behind the tree-line, Ethan looked up at the darkening sky, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet routine. Ethan continued his walks in the forest, feeling more connected to the land than ever before. Each step he took felt like a way of honoring his father's legacy, a way of remembering Paul not just as the man who had died to protect him, but as the man who had loved the forest and everything in it. But as autumn deepened, word came from Megan and Todd that it was time for Ethan to return to the city for school. They were understanding, of course. They wanted what was best for him, but they still believed that a return to normal life in the city would be good for him. They didn't fully grasp the depth of Ethan's connection to the woods, to his father. Ethan stood at the edge of the forest one last time, staring into the sea of trees that had been his refuge. He thought of the noise, the confinement, the emptiness that awaited him in the city. He thought of how far he had come, of the peace he had found here, of the way the forest had healed him when nothing else could. But most of all, he thought of his father. Paul had lived for the wilderness, and in his final moments, he had chosen to die for it too. Ethan realized now that returning to the city would be like leaving his father behind, and that wasn't something he was ready to do. The next morning, Ethan sat down with Harold and Lydia, his heart pounding in his chest. He had made up his mind, but he wasn't sure how to say it. "I don't want to go back to the city," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "I want to stay here, in the forest." Lydia exchanged a glance with Harold, who simply nodded. "We figured as much," Harold said with a grin. "This place has a way of getting into your blood." "But Megan and Todd," Lydia began, her voice hesitant, "they've done so much for you, Ethan. Are you sure this is what you want?" Ethan nodded firmly. "They'll understand. They know I don't belong in the city. Not anymore." Lydia's eyes softened, and she reached out to squeeze Ethan's hand. "All right," she said gently. "We'll talk to them. We'll make it work." Ethan smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had made his choice. This was where he belonged, in the forest where his father's memory would always live on. Later that day, Ethan returned to his father's oak tree one last time. He knelt by the base of the trunk, resting his hand on the bark, and closed his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The wind stirred through the branches above, and for a moment, it felt like the forest itself was answering him, whispering back with the voice of his father, telling him that he had made the right choice. As Ethan stood and walked back through the woods, the sun breaking through the clouds in soft rays of light, he knew in his heart that this was where he would stay, in the forest. in the place where he had found peace and where he could carry on his father's legacy. He wasn't running anymore. He was home. Want more stories that grip your heart and keep you on the edge of your seat? Subscribe now and never miss an emotional, thrilling journey like Ethan's. Subscribe to the channel and dive into the next adventure.